Two guards told a former Navy SEAL to skip his son's graduation, and what the general did to the guards will leave you totally shocked. He drove 8 hours with nothing but a photo of his late wife on the dashboard, and a promise echoing in his heart, "I'll be there." Solomon Drayton didn't come for attention. He came for his son. Dressed in the uniform he once wore through fire, water, and war, he took his seat quietly at the back of the graduation hall, unaware that 2 security guards were about to challenge his right to be there. What happened next wasn't loud. It wasn't violent, but it changed everything. Because when those guards asked him to leave, 5 men stood up from the crowd without a word, men who didn't need a uniform to be recognized. They were SEALs, brothers, and they had come for him. It had been 3 years since Solomon Drayton had stepped onto a military base, 5 since he'd been in uniform, and nearly 20 since he first walked into the crucible that would make him a Navy SEAL. Now standing outside a crowded high school gymnasium in Birmingham, Alabama, he adjusted the collar of his dress blues and took a deep breath. The smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with exhaust from nearby traffic. It was just a school parking lot, but for Solomon, it felt like a battlefield of a different kind. His son, Tyran, was graduating today, a milestone Solomon had promised never to miss. Even when his wife passed 2 years ago, even through the long sleepless nights and the ache in his knees that wouldn't quit, he never let go of that vow. When the day comes, I'll be there. So here he was, aged but upright, silver, edging the black of his hair, ribbons resting over a chest that had once carried teammates out of burning buildings and across hostile borders. He didn't come for glory. He didn't come to be seen. He came to honor his word, but some promises carry more weight than the world is ready for. Some stories begin quietly, with a seat taken, a glance exchanged, and a silence that demands to be respected. That silence was about to break. Solomon didn't look like much to the kids rushing past him in cap and gown. To them, he was just another old man with a hard stare and a chest full of medals no one could name. He sat alone, hands folded, back, straight, eyes fixed on the stage like it was a sniper's scope. But if you looked closer, if you really looked, you'd see something different. You'd see a man who didn't flinch at sudden noises, who scanned exits and faces as naturally as breathing. You'd see the stiffness of a spine molded by decades of discipline and a heart heavy with both pride and pain. The SEAL trident on his chest wasn't for show. It was a memory of storms weathered, brothers lost, and missions no one would ever know about. In the years since his retirement, Solomon had withdrawn from the spotlight. The Navy had given him purpose, structure, but life after, that was the harder war. His wife, Lorraine, had been his anchor, the only one who understood the silence in him. Since she passed, the world had gotten louder, and he'd gotten quieter. He lived modestly now outside Montgomery, fixing up old cars and visiting his wife's grave on Sundays. But no matter how far he drifted from the world, one thing never changed: his word. And when Tyran, just 13 at the time, asked, "Will you be at my graduation?" Solomon didn't hesitate. "Not even death could stop me," he'd said. Now as the crowd filled in and parents jostled for photos, Solomon didn't move. He wasn't there to prove anything. He was there to keep a promise. And that was more than enough. It started with a glance. One of the security guards, tall, young and clearly annoyed, pointed toward Solomon and muttered something to his partner. The second man, heavier, squinting through his sunglasses, gave a slow nod. Together, they began making their way through the rows of folding chairs, weaving through the murmuring crowd. Solomon noticed them immediately. He didn't need to stare. Years of training had taught him to read body language like a book. These weren't men offering help. They were coming with purpose, with misunderstanding, with authority they hadn't earned. The taller one arrived first. "Sir, this area is reserved for family," he said, his tone clipped and sharp, the way people talk when they think they're above correction. "I am family," Solomon replied calmly, without looking up. The guard shifted. "We've had a complaint. You're not on the approved guest list. I'm going to have to ask you to move." Solomon slowly turned his head. "I drove 8 hours to sit here for my son. I'm not moving." The second guard stepped in. "We're not trying to start anything, sir. But if you don't comply, we'll have to escort you outside. That word, escort, hung in the air like a challenge. A few people nearby turned to look. A woman clutched her purse. A man whispered to his daughter, but no one spoke up. Not yet. Solomon stayed, seated. He didn't argue, he didn't threaten. His silence said enough, and that's when things started to shift. From 3 rows back, a man stood. No uniform, just jeans and a simple black t-shirt. He said nothing, but his posture, firm, protective, made the guards hesitate. Another man rose near the bleachers, then another by the far wall, and 2 more behind the press table. Quiet, still, like statues with fire in their veins. 5 men, all former SEALs, all once saved by Solomon Drayton. They didn't need to speak to be understood. The 2 guards didn't know what to do. What had started as a simple directive, remove the old man from the wrong seat, had suddenly become something else, something heavier. They could feel it in the stillness, in the way those 5 men watched without blinking. Solomon hadn't moved. His hands remained folded in his lap. His eyes never left the stage. He wasn't posturing. He wasn't daring them. He was simply present. And in that presence was a weight they didn't understand but couldn't ignore. The first man who had stood, a wiry figure with a long scar curling around his temple, took 1 slow step forward. "So you really want to keep pushing this?" he asked the guards, voice calm as a late-night tide. "No one's trying to cause trouble," one of the guards mumbled, but the certainty in his voice was gone. The second man, broader, arms crossed, over his chest like granite slabs, added quietly, "That man's done more for this country than anyone in this gym, including you." One of the guards glanced at the SEAL trident on Solomon's chest, perhaps for the first time recognizing it for what it was. Recognition flickered, then hesitation. A murmur began to ripple through the crowd, people leaning to one another, eyes widening, phones discreetly lifted, not for social media, but in awe, in respect. Still, Solomon didn't speak. He didn't need to. His strength wasn't in defiance, it was in resolve, a kind forged in training that broke lesser men, her quiet dignity that didn't ask for permission to exist, and somehow the quiet became louder than any voice could have been. The guards didn't step back, not yet, but they stopped moving forward. Something in them, maybe instinct, maybe decency, told them they'd already gone too far. It was the smallest of details that broke the spell. A boy in the 3rd row whispered to his father, "What's that badge?" pointing at Solomon's chest. The man leaned in, squinting. And when his eyes landed on the trident, gold against dark navy, and he froze, then straightened. "That's a SEAL," he said quietly. "That's a Navy SEAL." The words weren't loud, but they traveled, like a match in dry grass. Soon the murmurs turned to recognition, the medal rack, the posture, the silence. It all began to click into place. The crowd wasn't just looking at a man in uniform anymore. They were looking at a legend they hadn't realized was sitting among them. A teacher near the sidewall covered her mouth. A student near the stage nudged his friend. Even the school principal, busy adjusting the microphone, paused mid-sentence as the energy in the gym shifted. The security guards glanced at each other, now visibly uncomfortable. They weren't trained for this. Not for the kind of presence that didn't raise its voice, but commanded the room. One of the guards tried to save face. "Look, sir, maybe we can find you a different seat." That's when the 4th man, the one near the bleachers, stepped forward. He had a limp, the kind that told a story all on its own. He looked directly at the guard and said, "You're about to cross a line you won't come back from." The tone was flat, not threatening, just final. And that's when the 5th man spoke, the one closest to the press table, eyes like steel under a worn ball cap. "Solomon Drayton carried me out of Kandahar with a bullet in my spine. He doesn't move for anyone." The gym went still. Now even the guards understood. They hadn't been dealing with a trespasser. They had been standing over a man whose silence came from a place they couldn't even begin to comprehend. And for the first time, they took a step back. What started as a quiet confrontation was now something no one could ignore. The principal, realizing the gravity of what had just unfolded, whispered hurriedly to a staff member. The stage lights dimmed for a moment as they adjusted the program, trying to maintain control. But the ceremony had already been upstaged, not by scandal or chaos, but by reverence. People began to stand, not in protest or panic, but in something close to tribute. Parents with hands over hearts, students nudging each other with wide eyes. Even the band in the corner fell silent, unsure whether to play or simply bear witness. The 5 men who had stood for Solomon didn't sit back down. They stood sentry-like, scattered throughout the gym, quiet and still. They weren't looking for a fight, they were just there. A wall of honor. Solomon remained seated, not proud, not smug, just present. He never looked at the guards again. He didn't need to. They lingered for a moment longer, unsure of their place in the scene they had unintentionally ignited, and then, silently, they moved away, disappearing toward the back of the gym. It wasn't long before phones started buzzing, not with calls but with messages. Parents texting loved ones, "There's a Navy SEAL here. Something incredible just happened. You should have seen it." But Solomon didn't notice the ripple. His eyes were still fixed forward, waiting for one name, Tyran Drayton, and somewhere in the crowd, his son had seen everything. The guards had tried to displace a man they thought was alone. Instead, they had revealed a brotherhood that needed no words, no announcement, a brotherhood that simply rose. And the rest of the gym? They were left in the wake, watching, listening, and learning what real respect looked like. The ceremony resumed, but it no longer held center stage. Every movement, every word from the podium happened under the weight of what had just occurred. Solomon's presence had changed the atmosphere, not by design, not by demand, but by the undeniable force of earned respect. As the valedictorian gave her speech and students prepared to cross the stage, a man approached Solomon quietly from the aisle. Dressed in a suit with salt and pepper hair and a badge clipped to his belt, he knelt beside the chair. "Commander Drayton," he said softly, "I'm with the local Veterans Outreach. We've heard of you. Some of us served under men you trained." Solomon turned, eyes steady. "We're working with the academy downtown," the man continued. "They're starting a new program for at-risk youth. Kids with potential, but no direction. We could use someone like you, just a few days a month, a mentor, a name they'll respect." Solomon didn't answer right away. The man handed him a card. No pressure. Just think about it. And just like that, he stood and walked away, leaving Solomon with the card resting on his knee. It would have been easy to ignore, easy to chalk it up to sentiment in the moment. But the seed had been planted. For years, Solomon had lived a life of solitude, fixing engines, visiting a grave, staying out of the world's way. But now, in front of a crowd that had seen him, truly seen him, a door had cracked open. He glanced at the card. No promises, no duty, just a choice. The same kind of choice that had changed his life decades ago when he first raised his hand and took the oath. This wasn't about going back. It was about stepping forward, not for himself, but for others who hadn't yet found their footing. And Solomon, for the first time in a long while, wondered if maybe, just maybe, his mission wasn't finished. Later that night, Solomon sat in his Charger beneath a flickering streetlight outside a Waffle House just off the highway. The parking lot was nearly empty. His dress blues had been hung carefully in the back seat, and now he wore a plain t-shirt and jeans, the veteran's card still tucked in his pocket. He hadn't driven home yet. The smell of coffee wafted from the building behind him, but he hadn't gone inside. His thoughts were too loud for food. What did they want from him, really? A mentor? A role model? Did they know what he'd done? What he'd lost? He stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror. Older, yes, but still carrying the edge, still carrying ghosts. Lorraine used to say, "Some men fight battles, you carry them." And she was right. Solomon never walked away from the weight. He wore it. Wore it through deployments, through marriage, through fatherhood. Even in retirement, it hadn't left him. So the thought of going back, not to war, but to service, wasn't something he took lightly. What if he failed them? What if his silence, his way of moving through the world, didn't reach those kids? What if he was too broken to lead anyone anymore? But then, as the night air drifted through the open window, he thought of Tyran, of the way his son had looked from the stage when their eyes met, a look that didn't need words. A look that said, "Now I understand." He thought of the men who'd stood for him, uncalled, uncoordinated, just present. He thought of the guards, and how easily perception could erase a man's story if no one stood to remind the world who he truly was. Maybe it wasn't about being perfect. Maybe it was about showing up for someone else, just like he always had. Solomon pulled the card from his pocket and set it on the dashboard next to Lorraine's photo. "I'll think about it," he murmured. But deep down, he already knew. 2 weeks later, the front gate of Jefferson Military Academy buzzed open, with a mechanical groan as Solomon's Dodge Charger rolled slowly through. The guard on duty gave a casual wave, not yet realizing the caliber of the man behind the wheel. Solomon had kept the card. He hadn't called, hadn't emailed. He just showed up. Word spread fast once he walked through the doors. The commandant, a former Marine named Lockett, met him at the entrance with a handshake that turned into a two-handed clasp. "Didn't think you'd come," he said. "I said I'd think about it," Solomon replied. "I did." Lockett grinned. "You still move like a man who doesn't ask twice." Solomon gave the faintest shrug. "You still need help?" "Always." That first day, Solomon didn't give a speech. He didn't outline his history. He just watched, from the back of a training room, arms crossed, listening as kids stumbled through drills and fumbled with ropes and attitude. They were rough, raw. A few had potential. Most had never seen a man stand the way he did. By the end of the week, they were asking who he was. By the end of the month, they were standing straighter when he entered the room. He didn't lecture. He demonstrated. He didn't yell. He expected. He didn't ask for respect. He made them want to earn it. One boy, tall, angry, with a chip on his shoulder and a record to match, tried to test him during PT. "You think you're better than us just 'cause you're old?" he barked. Solomon didn't blink. He just pointed to the bar. "Beat me, then we'll talk." 20 pull-ups later, the boy lay panting in the grass. Solomon hadn't broken a sweat. No more challenges came after that. The academy changed, slowly but deeply. Solomon didn't replace anyone. He didn't want a title, but he became something more powerful than any position. He became presence. And when Tyran visited one Saturday, watching from the back of the training field, he saw his father not just as a figure from the past, but as a force still shaping the future. By spring, the academy felt different. There was less yelling, more focus, fewer fights, more discipline. Not because Solomon had demanded it, but because his presence had redefined the air itself. He moved through the halls like a tide, slow, steady, and impossible to ignore. One morning, a cadet left a note taped to his locker. "I didn't quit today because I imagined what you'd say if I did." Another, a quiet kid from Selma who'd once flinched at every raised voice, now led morning drills. He'd started staying after class, asking Solomon about decision-making under fire, about how to stay calm when everything's burning. Solomon gave answers that didn't come from textbooks. They came from memory, from loss, from love. The staff noticed it too. Lockett called it the Drayton effect, a change that couldn't be taught, only absorbed, and it didn't stop at the academy. One evening, Solomon sat on the bleachers after a long training session, rubbing his knees. Tyran joined him, still in civilian clothes, a folder in his hand. "I've been thinking," his son said. "I want to apply to officer training, not just enlist. I want to lead." Solomon turned, surprised. "You sure?" Tyran nodded. "I watched you. That day at graduation, the way they stood for you, the way you never raised your voice, I saw what leadership looks like." Solomon didn't smile, not fully, but his eyes did. That night, he helped Tyran polish his personal statement. And when they finished, Tyran asked the one question that had been sitting in his chest for years. "Were you always this way?" Solomon looked out over the empty field. "No," he said, "but I always showed up, even when I didn't feel like enough." That answer sat with Tyran in a way no lesson ever had, and across the academy and beyond, Solomon Drayton's name began to mean something again, not on the news, not in headlines, but in hearts. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the twist arrived, not with fanfare, but with a knock on Solomon's front door. He opened it to find a woman in her late 30s, dressed in civilian clothes but standing like someone who had once known command. Her face was familiar, but worn, the kind of familiarity that whispered from the edges of memory. "You don't remember me," she said gently. Solomon studied her. "You're right, should I?" She nodded. "My name's Tasha Boone. My father was Chief Marcus Boone. You served with him in Ramadi. He didn't make it back." The name hit like a sudden wave, fast, cold, undeniable. Solomon stepped back instinctively, making space for her to enter. Tasha walked in slowly, looking at the photos on his walls. "You wrote to my mom after he died, said he went down protecting his brothers, said he never ran." "I remember," Solomon said, voice low. "My mum kept that letter, folded it 1,000 times. Read it every year on his birthday." Solomon nodded, silent. "I'm not here to reopen old wounds," Tasha continued. "I'm here because I run a program now, outreach for veterans' families, kids who lost someone in service and never got a map forward." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "I want you to speak just once, not about war, about showing up, about what my dad did for his team, what you did. They need to hear from someone real." Solomon stared at the folder, the weight of the past suddenly present in the room. "I'm not good with speeches," he said. "You don't have to be," she replied. "You just have to show up." The words echoed back at him, and the very phrase he'd lived by, the very phrase he'd given Tyran. Tasha smiled softly. "He'd want them to learn from you. I think he'd want me to." "Too?" Solomon took the folder in his hands. He had no words, only a quiet nod. Sometimes the past doesn't haunt. It calls. The auditorium wasn't full. Maybe 60 seats out of 200 were taken. Some parents, some students, a few veterans in faded hats. The room didn't expect greatness, just a moment, maybe a story. Solomon stood at the edge of the stage, holding nothing in his hands. No notes, no script, just memory and weight. He looked out at the young faces staring back, some curious, some bored, some hurting in ways they hadn't found words for. He cleared his throat. "I'm not here to talk about medals," he began, "or missions or enemies." A pause, the room settled. "I'm here because someone showed up for me once, when I was lost, a man named Chief Marcus Boone. He didn't save me with speeches. He saved me by standing between me and something that would have taken everything." Solomon looked down for a beat, then back up. "You all have battles. Not all of them wear uniforms, but they're real. And you're not weak because they hurt." He walked a few steps across the stage, slowly. "I was a Navy SEAL for most of my life. I saw things no one should see. I lost people, I lost parts of myself. But the only reason I'm standing here is because I kept showing up. For them, for my son, for myself." A quiet sniffle echoed from the back row. "You don't have to be strong all the time. You just have to be present. That's the first fight you win." When he finished, there was no thunderous applause, just silence, deep, settled, like the room needed a moment to breathe. Tasha stepped to the side of the stage, eyes glassy. One by one, the students began to rise. Not dramatically, not like a movie, just in respect. A quiet standing ovation for a man who didn't demand it, and would never ask for it. Later that evening, Solomon sat alone in the front seat of his Charger again. The same photo of Lorraine still on the dash, the same card still in the visor. But this time something was different. He wasn't alone in the silence. He was home in it. That night, as the world quieted outside his window and the hum of the ceiling fan became the only sound in the room, Solomon sat at the small wooden desk where Lorraine once paid bills and wrote Christmas cards. A half-empty glass of water rested beside him. The letter he'd written to Tyran years ago, one meant to be opened only if something happened to him during deployment, lay unfolded before him now. He read it again, not because he had to, but because he needed to remember who he'd once been and how far he'd come. In it he had written, "If you're reading this, I wasn't there like I promised, but I need you to know, everything I did was for you." Not just to protect you, but to show you what a man can be when he stands for something." He swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the ink fading slightly with time. So much had changed. Tyran had grown. The world had shifted. But the core of it, honor, brotherhood, presence, that hadn't changed. He thought of Lorraine, of the way she used to hold his wrist when his nightmares were too loud to silence. He thought of the brothers who'd stood up in that gym without needing a signal. He thought of Tasha, of the way healing sometimes came decades late but arrived right on time. And he thought of the young man his son was becoming, not in his shadow, but walking beside it. Solomon took a pen from the drawer, and beneath, the letter's final line added something new. "Son, I was there, I made it, and now so will you." He folded the paper slowly and placed it back into the envelope, sealing it with calm hands. For the first time in years, he felt the weight lift. Not gone, but lighter. He had lived through war, through grief, through invisibility. And still he stood. Because some men aren't made to be remembered in statues or news clips. They're made to remind the world, through quiet strength and unwavering presence, what honor really looks like. The sun was just beginning to rise over Montgomery when Solomon stepped out onto his porch, coffee in hand and silence wrapped around him like an old friend. The air was crisp, the sky brushed with orange and soft indigo. From the street, his house looked like any other, modest, quiet, tucked behind a low fence and 2 oak trees. But inside, something had shifted. Not in the walls, in him. He walked slowly to the flagpole beside the garden, a habit he'd kept for years. Lorraine had planted sunflowers there once, and even now some still fought their way through each season. He clipped the flag to the halyard, then paused before raising it. A voice rang faintly behind him. "Dad!" Tyran jogged up the path, out of breath, holding 2 coffees and wearing an officer candidate folder tucked under his arm. "Thought I'd catch you before work." Solomon nodded, accepting the second cup. They stood side by side, 2 silhouettes against the dawn. Father and son, legacy and future. Tyran watched as his father raised the American flag slowly, the cloth catching the wind with a gentle snap. "Still wake up this early every day?" Tyran asked. Solomon smiled faintly. "Can't seem to stop." The flag reached the top. Solomon tied off the rope, then stepped back with Tyran. Neither of them saluted, they didn't need to. The moment spoke enough. "I turned in the application," Tyran said, sipping his coffee. Solomon looked at him, eyes proud but measured. "Good. And I put your name down for reference." Solomon gave a small grunt of approval. Tyran glanced at the flag, then at the house. "You ever think about writing a book?" Solomon shook his head. "The people who need to remember already do." They stood there a minute longer, not speaking, and when Tyran finally walked back to his car, Solomon remained, still, calm, eyes on the flag dancing in the breeze, no medals on his chest. No audience to applaud, just a man, a memory, and a nation he still believed in. As the sun climbed higher and the neighborhood stirred to life, Solomon Drayton stepped back inside his home, his footsteps slow but steady. The world outside kept moving. Kids caught buses, radios clicked on, lawn sprinklers buzzed. But inside this house, legacy lived. Not in trophies or headlines, but in quiet acts, showing up when no one expected, standing firm when it would have been easier to walk away, and raising a son who saw the truth not in words, but in how a man carries his name. In a gymnasium on graduation day, 5 men had risen without being called. They didn't need a reason. They were the reason. And in that moment, the world was reminded of something we too often forget. Some of our greatest heroes move through life unnoticed, not because they are small, but because their humility is vast. Solomon Drayton never asked for thanks. He just made sure no one he loved ever stood alone.